Obviously, the non-randomness or coincidence, you decide how you see it, is being marked today in Kyiv. He is not alone. The NATO Secretary General is here together with representatives from all 32 member countries of the alliance. Of course, there were official meetings. So, what should we expect from this meeting, from this arrival, from this visit? And in fact, do you see any coincidence between what is happening directly in Enerhodar and who is currently visiting Kyiv?
It's unlikely that there are any real coincidences with Enerhodar here. Essentially, this is a way of preparing for the upcoming NATO summit. It will take place in Cyprus, Divankari, this July. And at this meeting, most likely these issues will be discussed. We also understand that Mr. Rutte has arrived with delegations from other countries, members of the alliance. Various security issues will be discussed. And in fact, the support for Ukraine that will be announced at this summit. So this is a kind of founding meeting which, in the future, God willing, will form, and it will create such a security framework for Ukraine in the future so that Ukraine truly receives security. If not guarantees, then at least enhanced security support in terms of weaponry. Likewise, interceptor missiles for anti-aircraft missile systems to strengthen and protect our skies. I think this issue will be discussed today in a more in-depth format so that in the future we can continue to develop these security discussions, implement them, and then announce them at the summit in Antalya.
In fact, if we manage to reach practical and effective results, it will only be a positive because it's clear that the words Patriot and anti-missile have recently dominated both the headlines and the reports. Moreover, we have official information from the President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky, that he is essentially giving another week in order to establish or improve the preparatory steps for implementing agreements on the purchase or supply of Patriots and anti-missiles. Otherwise, he says, there will be personnel consequences in Ukraine. Obviously, personnel consequences can only be applied to those who work in Ukraine. From your perspective, do you currently see any significant obstacles or potential roadblocks coming from Kyiv's side? Or do you see any unnecessary delays on our part? Perhaps something we still haven't fully resolved or worked out yet. Because obviously, well, it seems to me that it's clear that everyone in the world already understands why we need the Patriots and why we should receive more of them than we have now.
Well, publicly, there is no information about any obstacles, unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately. In fact, the president, I believe at the end of April, mentioned that June and July would be the decisive months. They will be crucial for resolving the issue of strengthening air defense. And in fact, he gave instructions so that Ukrainian diplomats and representatives would move forward and achieve their goals on this issue. If we understand that, as long as we don't have new missiles and there are no deliveries of this weaponry, then most likely the president really might be dissatisfied with the results. But here, we have to understand that not everything depends on Ukrainian officials, diplomats, or civil servants. To a large extent, that's the case here. Everything also depends on Ukraine's partners, both in Europe and in particular in the United States. The global stock of these missiles is not very large, and today indeed the whole world, against the backdrop of the US conflict in Iran, there is a shortage of these interceptor missiles up to Petrovsky. So here, Ukrainian officials can be blamed, but there are also objective reasons. Unfortunately, that's why these missiles are still not in Ukraine.
Ultimately, information emerged recently that Kyiv has officially requested a license to produce Patriot systems, either on its own or in collaboration with other manufacturers. But Washington... By the way, what was Washington's response? Maybe I missed it, because at the time I was following this information, there was no official response. But there was a preliminary response, a reaction to Poland's request, that they are ready to produce not interceptor missiles for Patriots, but other types of equipment. Washington refused to supply other types of missiles, other types of rockets. So what are the real options for us with these Patriots?
Let me clarify a bit here, specifically about the missiles, the interceptors for the Patriots, and the localization of production. The same thing happened in Poland, and in fact, the Poles received a preliminary agreement, a preliminary approval. In order to produce these missiles, we need to understand that Washington is unlikely to agree to transfer the license and production technology. There are no such technological interceptor missiles for Patriot in Ukraine because they assess the risks and understand that the production could be destroyed and the technology could, so to speak, fall into Russian hands. In fact, here we can also cite the example of Germany. Germany also tried to obtain permission to produce these interceptor missiles, but likewise did not receive it. And in this regard, Poland is making a bit more progress than all the other countries in Europe. The Poles have a rather strong lobby in America, and they have quite close contacts with American officials. We can actually see how Poland is becoming, in effect, a bastion of American weaponry on the European continent. And so it's not surprising that the Americans are, to some extent, also trying to strengthen them on NATO's eastern flank.
And here the issue is about the economy. Here it's exclusively about lobbying. Do you see it in other areas as well, Anton?
This issue could arise in other areas too, but it's also about the economy and production capabilities. The Poles have now set a course for rearmament. They have a large number of... Currently, they are receiving supplies mainly of American and South Korean weapons, and they are trying to localize certain production cycles of these types as much as possible. They already have established weapons production in Poland. They have a developed military-industrial complex that produces Polish models of weaponry. And in fact, based on this, they will use their already existing military-industrial complex. They will try to localize production, including that of Patriot missiles. But again, this is also a political issue. It's about strengthening Poland and essentially the support of the Polish government by the United States. Again, we can recall the deployment of military bases on Polish territory and the transfer of additional troops. So in this regard, the Americans and the Poles are cooperating quite closely.
Okay. For us, it's clear that the process from transferring the license to mass-producing anti-missiles is lengthy and not fast. I have a question. What about us? What is our real option?
Our real option, if we're talking about anti-ballistic defense, it's an attempt to develop our own systems that could effectively intercept this ballistic missile threat. In fact, right now there is talk about a pan-European shield, the creation of a pan-European shield, the UFRI project, where essentially from various components of European defense manufacturers, these are foreign radars, European radar systems, launchers, a Ukrainian missile, a pan-European shield will be formed in which various parties will be involved. There are a large number of European manufacturers involved, so that all of this is done in cooperation, so to speak, for the overall security of Europe. But we need to understand that this is also quite a lengthy and rather complex process. Although it is reported that the production of the Ukrainian FP-7X missile is already in its final stages. But still, this process may also encounter resistance, so to speak, from certain lobbyists, both European and American as well. And here, problems may arise in implementing this issue. But this is the only step where Ukraine must rely solely on itself, and in fact look for solutions independently and also with the support of partners.
What we have found, the path we have actually paved for ourselves independently, as you put it, concerns sanctioned flights over Russian territory. Today, incredibly, there is a beautiful scene, in fact, in St. Petersburg. It is very, very symbolic. Let's start with the fact that Peskov declares that Putin will speak at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum with a report on the economy and economic problems. Excuse me, but the phrase economic problems and Putin, it seems that Putin has problems. But if it doesn't seem that way to someone, they can look at the photos and videos. At the moment when they march to Putin's favorite event, well, you could say that Valdai competes with Spiv for the strength of his affection. They march against the backdrop of beautiful, dense, heavy clouds. From what is burning at the oil refinery port in St. Petersburg. There were several hits at once, at least. If we're talking about the oil pumping station, the oil transshipment facility, then we can confirm at least 3 hits, unless the information has changed. And there was a ship called Boyki, but now it no longer exists, judging by this?
Yes. In other words, Ukrainian drones continue to impose sanctions. Then I would note that, simply put, in Russia no one asked for permission to hold this economic forum. In fact, Ukraine, without granting permission, decided to make a few adjustments.
To embellish, enhance, and add a distinctive aroma and visual touch.
To make it more vibrant. In fact, there have been strikes on industrial facilities of Russia's oil and gas sector. There was a hit by a Ukrainian drone on... This is a missile corvette, the Boyki, which the Russians previously used actively in the Baltic Sea and in the ocean. It was used to escort their Shadow Fleet tankers. Here, it's quite an eloquent gesture that demonstrates that both in the Baltic and the Black Sea, the Russians have no peace. And in fact, if Ukraine has already essentially seized the initiative in the Black Sea and is dictating its own terms through the Ukrainian strategy of this asymmetric use of drones, then with the help of aerial drones and UAVs, Ukraine can also influence the situation in the Baltic theater. Here we need to understand that the threat to the Russians comes both from the south and from the north, and they will not be able to cover all their vulnerable spots, let alone resolve the pressing economic issues being discussed at this forum.
Listen, well, actually, Peskov comes out and says that basically the whole point of conducting the so-called special military operation is to prevent such strikes from happening. At the same time, he says that the special military operation could end in a single day. when Ukrainian troops, and I'm quoting here, leave the territory that belongs to Russia? Don't you get it?
Here, I would point out the so-called special military operation. It started with the claim that such strikes would not happen at all. They argued that the special military operation was being launched to prevent preemptive attacks or offensives by NATO or Ukraine on Russian territory. Now they're getting something completely different. In their society, more and more questions are arising about how it happened that what was started to protect us has now led to the Russian authorities being unable to protect us from drone attacks. And this concerns both the Russian elites and, first and foremost, ordinary Russian citizens, who quite often suffer directly from these strikes, as well as, so to speak, the environmental pollution that is actually caused by these strikes as a result of Russian aggression towards Ukraine. Therefore, they must be held accountable for this and understand that the Russian authorities cannot protect them. And we can see this very clearly today when, so to speak, it is being decorated with fireworks. The Forum in St. Petersburg.
Let's talk about something serious. First of all, forgive me, but we have not yet fully endured the attacks. The previous ones were on Ukrainian cities. And yes, we understand that Kyiv, the Kyiv region, and Dnipro suffered the most recently, but also Kherson region, Kharkiv, Odessa, Mykolaiv region, Zaporizhzhia. Forgive me, but the list is enormous. Obviously, the Russians will not stop. Here I should ask you, why the focus on Zircon missiles and where the math doesn't add up? Because, on the one hand, intelligence reports say that they can produce about 3 Zircons per month, give or take. The Russians, and on the other hand, there is talk of 230 Zircons stockpiled. Did they accidentally add an extra 0 to the 230 in Russian statistics, or what? Can you explain?
Actually, 230 is the number of missiles they've managed to accumulate and produce over the past few years. That is until December 2025, according to the GUAR, they were producing up to 10 missiles per month. And for almost 2 years since they put this type of missile weapon into service, they have practically not used it. That is, there were isolated cases when they struck Ukrainian territory with these missiles. And in some cases, Ukrainian air defense successfully handled and intercepted these targets, particularly over Kyiv. In fact, during this period, they managed to accumulate about 200 to 230 missiles. But today, according to intelligence data, the production rate has dropped and is now about 3 missiles, up to 3 missiles per month. That is, the production rate has somewhat decreased. There could be many reasons for this, including sanctions restrictions, yes, on electronics that can be used in these missiles, as well as our own long-range, so to speak, sanctions that target the manufacturing facilities of the Russian military-industrial complex. But the situation is such that they still have a large number of these missiles. And, in fact, they can use them now, even though they have established production, but not in the same volumes as with other types of weapons. That is, we're not talking about Iskanders here, which are produced in large quantities, but they do have this stockpile. And
let's calculate the current potential of Russia's military-industrial complex. What does it look like? How many could there be, if we're not talking about Zircons, but about other types of weapons they're using against rear cities? Because we clearly understand that 1,500 drones is an absolutely reasonable and attainable number, given the recent attacks.
In fact, if we're talking now about the greatest threat to Ukrainian security, it's ballistic missiles. So essentially, the Russians are now placing their biggest bet on ballistic missiles. The same goes for the Zircon. It is essentially a hypersonic ballistic missile that flies at hypersonic speed along a ballistic trajectory. And if we talk about Iskanders, which they are actively using, for example, in the latest attack they used 33 Iskanders, then according to the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine, their production is about 60 missiles per month. And in fact, if we compare the rate of production and the rate of use of these missiles, we can cautiously say that they are practically, if not literally, taking these missiles straight off the production line, then they may already be starting to dip into their reserves. There, again, we need to check with the data from the Defense Intelligence of Ukraine. And if I'm not mistaken, it's about 200 missiles that they have as a strategic reserve of Iskanders, which they are not supposed to use, keeping them for possible future conflicts. But most likely, in order to maintain this effect and the systematic strikes that the Russian authorities are carrying out, they might even dip into these reserves. So we can see that in the previous stage there were 33 missiles, and before that it was also around 30. That's essentially a month's worth of production. They have used it. So here it is quite reasonable to assume that they are already spending even missiles that they have in their strategic reserves in order to take advantage of the window of opportunity when Ukraine cannot effectively intercept ballistic missiles to inflict maximum damage on Ukrainian civilians, on Ukrainian military industrial facilities, infrastructure, and in fact to demonstrate their strength in this way.